Some mornings unfold with a kind of stillness that feels rehearsed, as though the world itself had quietly agreed to cooperate. The sky over Washington, D.C. was unusually clear that day, not a cloud in sight. The sun filtered through the vast glass panels of Reagan National Airport, pouring warm light over polished stone floors and passengers shuffling past with their wheeled luggage trailing obediently behind. Inside Gate 12, everything moved with an familiar rhythm. A calm voice echoed from the intercom system, announcing Flight 786 to Denver. Families held paper cups of coffee with both hands. Businessmen stared blankly at their screens. Toddlers tugged at their parents' sleeves while airport employees navigated the terminal with practiced indifference. It was, by every outward appearance, just another departure morning. But not everything ordinary stays that way. And sometimes all it takes is one look to set off a chain of consequences no one saw coming. Malcolm Reed stepped into the terminal with a quiet grace that drew no attention. He wasn't dressed like someone who sought it. No designer labels, no flashy accessories, just a deep charcoal overcoat, a navy wool scarf tucked neatly around his collar, and polished leather shoes that whispered more than they shouted. In one hand, he carried a vintage leather satchel. The other rested calmly by his side. To the casual observer, he was perhaps a professor or a writer. Maybe a retired gentleman visiting family. What no one knew, or could know, was that Malcolm Reed was a federal judge, a man who had spent decades dismantling injustice from inside the very system that once tried to exclude him. He had presided over landmark civil rights cases, advised multiple administrations, and quietly mentored a new generation of legal minds committed to reform. But none of that was visible now, and that was how he preferred it. Until she saw him. Melissa Grant had been a flight attendant for nearly 15 years, experienced, efficient, always the first to notice anything out of place. At least that's how she saw herself. And when her eyes met Malcolm's as he approached the first-class line, something in her expression flickered. Something small but sharp. It wasn't overt, just a narrowing of the eyes, a subtle tilt of the head. But it was there. Her instincts, honed less by training and more by bias, immediately kicked in. She took a half step forward as Malcolm offered his boarding pass with a courteous nod. "Good morning," he said softly. Melissa didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at the ticket, then at him, then back at the ticket again, as though she expected the ink to change before her eyes. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify this," she said, her tone clipped, almost rehearsed. Malcolm didn't flinch. "Of course," he replied, handing over his government-issued ID without hesitation. Melissa's eyes scanned the card, then paused. There it was, the Honorable Malcolm Reed. But instead of recognition, there was resistance. She stared at it, then at him again, as if trying to catch him in a lie that didn't exist. "Please wait here," she said sharply. "Just a moment." She turned and walked briskly toward the podium, murmuring something to another crew member. Malcolm stood silently. He was used to this, used to the slow, deliberate questioning, the sideways glances. The implication was that his presence in certain spaces required explanation. Behind him, the line of passengers waiting to board was growing. A few exchanged looks. One woman raised an eyebrow, clearly confused, but no one said a word. Melissa returned, this time with an airport security agent in tow. "I'm going to need to verify your seating assignment again," she said. Her voice was louder now, tinged with a kind of authority that overcompensated for uncertainty. "There's been some confusion." There hadn't been. Malcolm calmly pulled out a folded document from his coat pocket, an official confirmation of his seat, printed from his office the night before. "This should clarify it," he said. Melissa didn't look at the paper. "Sir, I'm asking you to step aside while we verify through our system," she said again. "Please cooperate." The agent beside her seemed uneasy. "Ma'am, everything here checks out," he said quietly after glancing at the document and ID. "He's booked for 1A. But Melissa wasn't backing down. "It's a matter of procedure," she insisted. "I've seen cases like this before." Cases like what? That's what Malcolm might have asked. But he didn't. Instead, he simply looked at her, not with anger, but with something deeper, something that made her momentarily shift in her stance. Then without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim, black phone. No drama, no threats. He pressed a single number, waited, then spoke quietly. Douglas, it's Malcolm. I'm at Reagan National, Gate 12, Flight 786. I'm being held from boarding. Yes, by name. Yes, her. I'll wait. And then he hung up. No shouting, no scene, just a phone call. Melissa blinked. The agent looked uncertain. Around them, the atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly. Something had changed, not in the volume of voices or the movement of people, but in the air itself. Malcolm stepped to the side, hands folded calmly in front of him. Melissa returned to her station, brushing off a strange feeling creeping up her spine. After all, she had done nothing wrong, right? But far above them, in a glass-paneled office in a downtown high-rise, the man on the other end of the call, Douglas Wexler, CEO of Altavia Airlines, was already standing up, his jaw set. He had just canceled 2 meetings, and a storm was beginning to form. 10 minutes had passed since Malcolm Reed made his quiet phone call. 10 minutes that felt longer than most flights. Passengers continued boarding in the background, their footsteps blending with the muted announcements over the intercom, while Malcolm remained exactly where he'd been instructed to stand. To wait, as Melissa Grant had put it. But waiting in this case was not compliance. It was the strategy. Melissa fidgeted at the podium, glancing repeatedly at her screen, even though she had already seen what it said. 1A, confirmed, Judge Malcolm Reed, first class. But something inside her refused to reconcile that fact. Maybe it was the years of assuming, of believing that her judgment, her snap assessments, were sharper than any computer-generated manifest. Or maybe it was pride. Pride in the way she'd climbed the ladder of airline seniority. Pride that blinded her to the obvious. She didn't notice the change at first, the energy shift. But the gate agent beside her did. A black car had pulled up to the curb outside the terminal. Not flashy, but official. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored Navy suit, flanked by 2 aides and followed by a uniformed airport supervisor, already fumbling with his radio. They moved with purpose. They moved with coordination, and they were moving toward Gate 12. "Is that?" the gate agent murmured. Melissa looked up. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Douglas Wexler, CEO of Altavia Airlines, the same Douglas who rarely made unannounced appearances anywhere, much less in a terminal during boarding hours. Within seconds, he was standing in front of her. "Ms. Grant?" he asked, voice low but unmistakably firm. Melissa straightened. "Yes, sir. This is unexpected. How can I help you?" "You can help," Douglas said, eyes not leaving hers, "by explaining to me in exact terms why Judge Malcolm Reed is standing over there, in plain view of your passengers, being treated like a trespasser in our most premium cabin." Melissa's face flushed. There was confusion about his boarding pass. It didn't match with, "Stop!" Douglas's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the space like steel. "You've worked for this airline long enough to know our guest lists are verified hours in advance. You've also worked long enough to know the value of discretion, and yet you challenged a federal judge with a confirmed first-class ticket and escalated the situation when your own staff confirmed his identity." "I didn't know who he was," she said quickly, trying to steady her tone. "I just followed standard protocol." "No, Ms. Grant, you followed something else," Douglas said, taking a step closer. "You followed an instinct, one that somehow didn't kick in when the white gentleman before him boarded with a handwritten upgrade slip." The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers near the podium had begun to notice. A woman across the gate whispered to her husband. A teenage boy nudged his sister. Phones weren't out yet, but they would be. Douglas approached, paused, then gently leaned down. "Your Honor," he said softly, "on behalf of Altavia Airlines, I want to extend my deepest apologies for what happened at the gate." Malcolm looked up, eyes steady. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Wexler, but this wasn't about me," he said. "It was about what it means when people are seen as out of place in spaces they've earned." Douglas nodded slowly. "I understand. We're going to handle this thoroughly and publicly." "I don't need a public apology," Malcolm said. "I need a change. And if you're serious about that, I'll help. For a moment, neither man spoke. The engine hum outside filled the silence. Then Douglas extended his hand. Malcolm took it. And with that, Flight 786 lifted off. Not just into the sky, but into something larger. A reckoning, a realignment, a shift. As Flight 786 ascended through the clouds, the hush inside the cabin was thick with unspoken awareness. Most passengers hadn't witnessed the full scene at Gate 12, but they felt its tremors. Whispers had begun before the plane even left the tarmac. That the man in seat 1A, the composed gentleman with the thoughtful eyes, had been almost kicked off by the flight staff. That someone from the top, someone important, had come to set things right. The truth, as always, traveled faster than the aircraft itself. Malcolm Reed sat quietly, his fingers interlocked on his lap. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expected. There was no gritted jaw, no simmering glare. There was just silence. The kind of silence that carried history, that bore the weight of too many similar encounters, stretched across a lifetime. A flight attendant approached, cautiously. Not Melissa, of course. She was gone. This was Reema Patel, a senior flight crew member with 20 years of experience, and none of Melissa's ego. "Mr. Reed," she began gently, kneeling slightly to lower her voice, "I'd like to apologize on behalf of the cabin staff. We were unaware of what had occurred at the gate, and I assure you, we intend to treat you with the dignity you deserve." Malcolm gave a slight nod. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness. May I get you anything to drink? We have fresh coffee, chamomile tea, ginger ale." "I'm fine for now," he said with a polite smile. "But could you do me one favor?" "Of course." He gestured toward the mid-cabin section. "Could you check on the young man in seat 12C? He was behind me in line this morning. I saw the agent make him step aside, too. He looked maybe 17. I just want to make sure he's all right." Reema blinked, surprised. Most first-class passengers rarely even notice the coach, but she nodded. "I'll take care of it." As she moved down the aisle, Malcolm leaned back slightly, letting his gaze drift out the window. The sky, at 35,000 feet, was a blanket of endless possibility. He'd always loved the stillness of air travel, how it forced the world below into perspective. But today, that stillness felt complicated, because injustice had followed him on board. In row 12, Daniel Whitmore sat wedged between a window and a business traveler who hadn't said a word since takeoff. Daniel's earbuds dangled loosely around his neck, but the music wasn't playing. He stared at the tray table, his sneakers nervously tapping the floor. He hadn't told anyone what happened. Not his mother, who'd hugged him goodbye that morning. Not his coach, who'd booked the ticket for the State Youth Leadership Conference in Denver. Certainly not the passengers nearby who assumed, like most do, that the kid in a hoodie and jeans was just another teenager flying solo. But Daniel hadn't forgotten the look on the agent's face at the gate, the way she scrutinized his ID twice, the way she scanned his boarding pass as if it must have been a mistake, or worse, a fake. He'd watched the older man ahead of him get stopped, watched the tension unfold, and then without fanfare, he was quietly pulled aside, told to wait for additional verification. Verification of what exactly? The agent never answered. He'd eventually been waved through. No apology, no explanation. Just a long stare and a tight-lipped, "You can board now." And now here he was, pretending it didn't sting. He looked up when a gentle hand tapped his arm. It was the flight attendant, Reema, crouching beside his seat. "Hi there," she said, voice calm and kind. "You're Daniel, right?" His brow furrowed slightly. "Yeah. I just wanted to make sure you're doing okay. I heard things at the gate weren't exactly smooth." Daniel blinked. It was fine. I mean, I'm on the plane." "I know, but it's not always about making it through. Sometimes it's about how you're treated along the way," she said gently. "If you need anything, snack, water, even just a quiet chat, I'm here." He hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. "Thank you." As she smiled and rose to leave, Daniel couldn't help but glance toward the front of the plane. Through the curtain, he could see just the edge of 1A. The older man from earlier was sitting still, composed. Daniel didn't know who he was, but he knew one thing. That man had stood his ground. And somehow, just knowing that made Daniel sit a little straighter in his seat. Back in first class, Malcolm opened his leather satchel and pulled out a slim journal. He didn't write often while flying, but something about this moment asked for reflection. His pen moved smoothly across the page. It happens in small places, airports, check-in desks, hotel lobbies, courtroom entrances. The moment of doubt, the raised eyebrow, the casual assumption. But if we don't challenge it, not with rage but with reason, we let it fester. Today, a gate agent saw a black man and assumed the seat was too good for him. What she didn't see was the weight I carry. Not just the robe or the title, but the lineage of those who couldn't sit in the front of a bus, let alone a plane. I don't want revenge. I want better questions asked, better assumptions dismantled. Dignity is not a luxury seat. It's right. He paused, letting the ink dry. Then he closed the journal and stared ahead. Because the flight wasn't over, and neither was the work. At precisely 10:42 a.m., somewhere high above the Midwest, the cabin of Flight 786 slipped into a temporary hush. Meal trays were being cleared, window shades drawn or half open. The soft hum of air pressure and distant engine roar provided the only ambient rhythm. It was the kind of lull when people either fell asleep or stared out, lost in thought. But Malcolm Reed was not sleeping. He had opened his phone for the first time since boarding, and what he saw on the screen froze him for a long second. There were two missed calls, one from Chief Justice Elena Barnes and one from the Secretary of Transportation. He slowly turned his phone to silent mode, then placed it face down on the tray in front of him. Something had shifted beyond the walls of the aircraft, and he hadn't even made his call yet. He leaned his head back, exhaled, closed his eyes for just a moment. Not out of weariness, but precision, deliberation. And then, without drama, he pressed the call button above his seat. Within seconds, Rima appeared. "Yes, Mr. Reed? Could I speak with the captain?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flickered with surprise. "Is everything all right?" "I believe so, but I'd like to request a few minutes of his time once it's convenient. You can let him know I'm a sitting federal judge. It's not a complaint. It's a matter of shared concern." Rima nodded slowly, reading more than he said. "I'll inform him now." In the cockpit, Captain Leonard Haynes sat upright, hands loosely guiding the plane with practiced calm. At 59, he was a veteran, not just of aviation, but of tight calls, rough landings, and tense days. He'd served in the military before commercial flying. There wasn't much that rattled him, but when Rima's voice came through his intercom and the words federal judge were spoken, he raised an eyebrow. "Did he mention what it's about?" "He said it's not a complaint, but he requested to speak with you. Privately, if possible." Leonard exchanged a look with his first officer, nodded, and clicked the intercom off. "I'll go." 5 minutes later, he stood in the first-class cabin, coat on, cap under his arm, his expression courteous but measured. "Judge Reed," he said, extending a hand. Malcolm stood and shook it firmly. "Captain Haynes, thank you for taking a moment." They stepped aside to a discreet section near the galley, where the curtain provided a touch of privacy. "I won't take long," Malcolm began. "I just want you to be aware of something that occurred at boarding. A gate agent named Melissa accused me of using a fake ticket. She suggested, loudly, that I must be lying, despite my identification and documentation." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She's since been removed from duty thanks to a senior official who happened to be present," Malcolm continued, carefully choosing his tone. "But this isn't about personal insult. It's about a pattern, an institutional lens that sees black professionalism as a contradiction. I have no interest in headlines or outrage, but I do believe in accountability." Leonard nodded slowly, folding his arms. "I appreciate your directness, Judge, and I understand what you're saying more than you might think. We've had these issues surface before, quietly or with legal consequences. Either way, they don't disappear by themselves." Malcolm looked him square in the eye. "Then let's not let this one disappear." "I agree." There was a pause. Not tense, thoughtful. Malcolm added, "There's also a young man in the economy who was treated similarly. Daniel Whitmore. Teenager, smart, observant. He doesn't need to be told the world is unfair. but he does need to see someone stand up to it. Captain Haynes gave a firm nod. I'll make sure his name is noted in my post-flight report, and I'll speak with corporate when we land. Malcolm offered a small, appreciative smile. That's all I needed. Thank you for hearing me. Meanwhile, in row 12, Daniel had noticed the captain walking toward the front and then ducking behind the curtain. He didn't know why it mattered to him, but something about the silent exchange made him sit up straighter again. His seatmate, the business traveler, finally looked up from his tablet. You okay, kid? The man asked unexpectedly. Daniel blinked. Yeah, why? You've been sitting like you're ready to run, the man said with a shrug. Daniel chuckled, caught off guard. Just thinking, he said. The man nodded once, then turned back to his screen. But the question lingered with Daniel longer than expected. Was he okay? Maybe not, but maybe, just maybe, he was less alone than he thought. Back in first class, Malcolm returned to his seat with a quiet resolve. He didn't need to go public. He didn't need cameras or lawsuits. That wasn't the point. The real power wasn't in punishing Melissa. It was in pulling back the curtain on what allowed people like her to feel so bold in the first place. Gate agents are trained not only in procedure, but in perception. Systems that asked, without saying aloud, does this person look like they belong? He pulled out his journal once more. To speak softly is not to accept injustice. Silence is only noble when chosen, not imposed. The plane jolted slightly as it entered a new jet stream. But inside Malcolm, things were settling. His voice had been heard. His presence was acknowledged. And perhaps, even more importantly, another young voice had been quietly defended. At that moment, in the Denver office of the Secretary of Transportation, a short email was being drafted. Subject, urgent. Flight 786 incident. We have a confirmed account from Judge Malcolm Reed regarding racial bias at Reagan National this morning. The incident was directly witnessed by federal personnel. I recommend immediate suspension of the gate agent involved and a review of current training protocols. We cannot afford silence, especially not now. The ripple had begun, and the turbulence ahead wouldn't be in the air. It would be on the ground. By the time Flight 786 touched down in Denver at 12:58 p.m., the city's afternoon sun was casting long, golden streaks over the tarmac. Inside the aircraft, passengers began to stir. Necks craned, seatbelts clicked, and phones lit up like a forest of quiet signals reconnecting to the world. But amid the casual flurry of post-landing rituals, something else was moving. Not just through the aisles, but through channels far more powerful than the seatback row. Judge Malcolm Reed remained seated, composed, watching the cabin move as if through slow motion. A soft buzz came through his phone. He glanced at it. Update, FAA office has initiated review. DOT is fully briefed. You've done more than you know. Barnes Malcolm placed the phone back down and folded his hands. He did not smile. He simply breathed, a slow, full inhale, as if reclaiming something that had been quietly taken for far too long. At the back of the plane, Daniel Whitmore sat still. His bag was zipped. His tray was upright. But his thoughts weren't on logistics. They were on what he had witnessed. He'd seen a black man, not shouting, not threatening, not begging for acknowledgement, simply move through the fire with his spine straight, and it had changed something in him. As the jet bridge connected, the door opened with a loud metallic click, and Rima stepped forward. Her face was neutral, but her eyes searched for one figure in particular. Mr. Reed, she said softly but clearly, the captain has requested you exit first. Passengers paused. Some turned to look. A few eyebrows raised. But Malcolm, unfazed, nodded and stood. He walked forward calmly, bag in one hand, journal in the other. As he passed through the cabin, Daniel tracked him, not out of awe, but out of purpose. And in that split-second moment, barely a glance exchanged, something passed between them. Quiet recognition. Dignity mirrored. Outside the terminal, a black sedan waited at the curb. The driver opened the door before Malcolm even stepped through the double glass doors. Justice Reed, he greeted respectfully. I'm no longer on the bench today, Malcolm replied with a subtle smile. Just Malcolm will do. But before he could step in, a sharp voice pierced through the low city hum. Excuse me, Mr. Reed? He turned. A woman approached. Not young, not old. Press badge on her coat, notebook in hand, phone in the other. My name is Karen Ellis from the Denver Chronicle. We received word about an incident on your flight. I know you're just arriving, but I'm not giving a statement, Malcolm replied, polite but firm. She paused, clearly expecting resistance, but not that kind. I understand. May I just ask, was it true what they're saying? That a gate agent accused you of fraud? That the airline tried to remove you? Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, what's true is that perception can sometimes masquerade as protocol. And what's dangerous isn't one employee, it's a culture that teaches them to assume who doesn't belong. Then he got in the car and closed the door. Back at Reagan National Airport, in a quiet HR meeting room, the tone was very different. Melissa Graham, the gate agent from that morning, sat pale and silent in front of a panel of supervisors. Her badge had already been deactivated. What exactly made you think the passenger's boarding pass was fraudulent? Asked one woman, clipboard in hand. Melissa's voice cracked. He didn't look like... Like what? Silence. Melissa, the man you accused is a federal judge, and the teenager you also delayed is the son of a senator. You've triggered a federal inquiry, and you may have jeopardized this airport's contract status. Her hands trembled slightly. I didn't know. I didn't mean... But you assumed, the supervisor cut in. And assumptions in our line of work don't just delay flights. They ruin lives, or spark national reform. Melissa stared down, tears pooling but unspilled. No one yelled. No one needed to. The silence in that room was punishment enough. Later that day, in a modest house just outside of Aurora, Colorado, Daniel sat across from his mother at the dinner table. His father wasn't home yet. You were quiet on the drive back from the airport, she said gently. Everything okay? He nodded, pushing a piece of broccoli around his plate. Yeah, just, thinking. About the trip or the man on the plane? He looked up. You saw the video already? She nodded, showing her phone. Someone posted it. It's going viral. Didn't show faces, just audio. The way he stayed calm, the way he said, I know exactly who I am. That part, it gave me chills. Daniel hesitated. I want to be like that, he finally said. His mother's eyes softened. You already are, baby, but now the world's going to start seeing it too. That evening, a quiet storm was brewing online. Judge Reed, Tuanashak, Gate 12, incident. Chanan, I know who I am. Tuanashak, do you? The hashtag spread like wildfire. Clips surfaced, not of the confrontation, but of security footage showing Melissa pacing at the gate, visibly agitated. Audio from a bystander's phone captured fragments of her words. That doesn't look like a federal judge to me. By midnight, the airline's CEO had released a brief statement. We are aware of a deeply troubling incident involving one of our employees and a federal judge. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities and reviewing all internal procedures. We deeply regret any harm caused. But by then, the damage was already beyond corporate control, because this wasn't just about one man, one flight, or one mistake. It was about the thousands of silent denials that happened every day, in gates, in offices, in classrooms, in boardrooms, where judgment slipped through not based on merit, but on melanin. And someone had finally said, enough. By sunrise the next morning, the news cycle had already crowned a new headline. Federal judge accused of fraud at airport. His calm response sparks nationwide reckoning. Local news outlets picked it up first. Then national ones followed. By noon, Malcolm Reed's name was trending across multiple platforms, even though he hadn't spoken a single word to the press. Because he didn't need to. His silence had said everything. But in a small Washington, D.C. townhouse, far from the media glare, Malcolm sat quietly at his kitchen table, sipping dark roast coffee, staring out the window. He hadn't turned on the news. He didn't check his phone. He didn't want to witness the swirl of voices trying to make sense of something that, to him, had long ago lost its mystery. Instead, he opened his journal and wrote only one line. If I had raised my voice, would they have called me aggressive instead of right? He didn't need an answer. He already knew. Elsewhere, in a bustling newsroom in Midtown Manhattan, journalist Karen Ellis stared at her screen. She had barely slept. The soundbite she captured, "What's dangerous isn't one employee. It's a culture that teaches them to assume who doesn't belong," had gone viral. She hadn't expected it. She only wanted to document the truth. But now she was being invited on MSNBC, CNN, and even a late-night talk show. Still, none of that felt like the real story. So she made a decision. Karen pulled up her draft notes and began typing a new feature piece. One that wouldn't just focus on the judge, but on the ripple effect. The ordinary people were quietly stirred by his courage. On Daniel Whitmore. Daniel, meanwhile, was walking into a classroom that suddenly didn't feel the same. A few classmates looked at him differently now. Not because he had done anything extraordinary, but because he had seen something extraordinary and had been changed. One girl whispered, "That's the kid who sat near the judge." Another boy nodded respectfully. Daniel didn't react. He didn't balk. He just sat down, opened his notebook, and started writing an essay titled, "When Dignity Doesn't Yell." Back in Denver, the airline's corporate headquarters were in full emergency mode. A conference room buzzed with top executives. The vice president of customer relations was pale, the PR director was losing her voice, and the head of HR had already sent 2 managers home. And at the center of the room stood CEO Gordon Maddox, tall, rigid, with silver hair and eyes that could either fire or forgive, depending on the hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice crisp, "this isn't just a PR issue. This is an institutional reckoning. We didn't just mistreat a federal judge. We exposed a rot we've ignored for too long." He let that land. No one spoke. Then he held up his phone, displaying a photo of Melissa Graham. "She has officially been terminated," he said, "but that doesn't resolve the core problem." Someone finally spoke up. "So what do? We go beyond apology. We reform." 2 hours later, Gordon Maddox stepped in front of a press podium for a live conference. His tone was measured. But there was something else in it too, almost humility. "Yesterday, our airline failed. Not only a passenger, not only a judge, but a principle. A principle that says we judge people by the content of their actions, not by the color of their skin or the bias of our assumptions. We have launched an independent investigation into our staff training practices, and we will be appointing a civil rights oversight committee to ensure that what happened at Gate 12 never happens again. To Judge Reed, we extend not just our apology, but our commitment to make sure the system that failed him is rebuilt with justice at its core." The room was silent as flashbulbs popped. It was a speech no one had expected from a man long considered cold and corporate. But the storm had shaken even his stone tower. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, an elderly black man named Harold Deacon sat at his breakfast table, watching the press conference on TV. He was retired now, once a civil rights attorney, now a grandfather with fading eyesight but a sharp mind. He turned to his wife. "You see that man, May?" he said, pointing at the judge's photo in the corner of the screen. "That's what quiet power looks like. That's what dignity taught under fire becomes." His wife nodded slowly, her hand covering her mouth. "Do you think things will finally change?" she asked. Harold didn't answer right away. Then, "They already have. Not enough, but more than yesterday." That night, Malcolm's phone finally rang, a number he hadn't seen in years. He hesitated, then answered. "Reed," a deep voice replied. "Malcolm, it's Justice Evelyn Hart," his old mentor, one of the first black women appointed to the federal bench, a living legend. "I saw what happened," she said. "And what didn't?" There was silence between them. Then she added, "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised the standard." Malcolm closed his eyes. "I just did what felt right." "No," Evelyn said. "You did what was necessary, and that's what makes the difference." The world didn't shift overnight. Airlines still flew. People still moved through terminals. But something subtle, yet seismic, had begun. Young black boys saw themselves in Malcolm. Mothers who had once feared sending their children to fly alone now held their heads just a little higher. And for every biased glance, every doubting smirk, there was now a memory floating in the public consciousness. A man is standing at a gate, not yelling, not begging, just knowing exactly who he was, and that knowing had become contagious. 2 weeks had passed. The headlines had shifted as they always did. New crises, new scandals, new distractions. But quietly, persistently, the story of Malcolm Reed continued to ripple beneath the surface of public life. Not because of what he said, but because of what he hadn't. And then something unexpected arrived. A letter. Not an email, not a tweet, not a viral post. A real letter, handwritten in neat cursive, stamped and sealed with care. It arrived at the courthouse addressed simply to Attendant Malcolm Reed, Federal District Judge, Washington, D.C. His clerk placed it on his desk with a soft tap, her face unreadable. When Malcolm opened it, the first line made him pause. "My name is Avery Kinsey. I was the gate agent standing beside Melissa Graham the day she humiliated you. And I've been carrying the weight of that silence every day since." He sat up straighter. Avery's letter wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. She confessed to freezing that day. She had known deep down that what Melissa was doing was wrong, but she'd stayed still, afraid of confrontation, afraid of losing her job, afraid of what it meant to speak out in front of her manager. "When you looked at her with dignity, I saw what I wasn't brave enough to be. You didn't have to raise your voice, but somehow it made mine rise inside me." Avery went on to say she had quit her job, not out of protest, but out of conscience. "I want to be someone my younger sister can look up to," she wrote, "and that starts with admitting the truth. I failed you that day, but I want to do something better now." At the bottom of the page, she included a suggestion, a training program, not the usual diversity modules checked off for HR compliance, but a story-based program led by real people who had endured injustice with dignity, people like Malcolm. "I don't know if anyone will listen to me," she ended, "but maybe they'll listen to you." Malcolm read the letter twice. Then he folded it gently and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. He already knew what he needed to do next. Meanwhile, across the country, young Daniel Whitmore was also writing, but not a letter. He was finishing an essay. He'd entered into a national student contest titled Voices of Change, and without telling anyone, not even his mother, he had written about the morning at Gate 12, about the man in the navy scarf and quiet eyes, about what it meant to witness injustice and see someone answer it without hate. "I learned that power doesn't always sound like shouting," Daniel wrote. "Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it stands its ground without fire, but burns brighter than any rage." He hit submit and let go of the outcome. What mattered was that he had finally said what had been stuck inside him for weeks. Back in D.C., Malcolm walked into a glass building on K Street, home to the headquarters of Transatlas Airlines. He wasn't alone. Beside him walked Gordon Maddox, the very CEO whose company had mishandled the incident. The two men, once worlds apart, were now aligned by something neither could quite name, but both recognized: responsibility. They were there to meet with a room full of executives and airline partners. Gordon cleared his throat and introduced him. "Judge Reed has kindly agreed to help us with the foundation of our new internal justice program. He will not be lecturing, he will be listening and guiding and asking us the hardest questions of all." Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Malcolm's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm as ever. "This isn't about shame, it's about clarity. You can't train out bias with checklists, but you can unlearn it through the story, through human experience, through truth." He reached into his coat and pulled out Avery Kinsey's letter, now in a clear, protective sleeve. "And this," he said, holding it up, "is what truth looks like when it's brave." He didn't have a PowerPoint. He had lived experience, and now it was finally being treated as evidence, not anecdote. Later that week, the airline released an official statement launching a pilot initiative called Gatekeepers for Justice, a storytelling-based empathy training program inspired by Judge Reed's experience and designed with his guidance. The press called it performative, but others called it something else: overdue. And as applications to join the program began flooding in, not just from airline staff, but from educators, corporate leaders, and transportation workers, Malcolm received a short, unexpected message from Justice Evelyn Hart. Just 3 words. Now it begins. At a small coffee shop near Howard University, a young journalism major named Karen Ellis was finishing her article. Her original headline had been rewritten 4 times. None of them felt right. Until she finally typed, "The man who didn't raise his voice and still moved a nation." She sat back, reread it, and smiled. Because it was true. Not all revolutions begin with marches. Some begin at a gate, with quiet and dignity, and the refusal to be small. 2 months after that morning at Gate 12, the rhythm of daily life at Reagan National Airport had returned. Flights were delayed and rerouted. Coffee carts hummed. Children laughed and cried in equal measure. Life went on, but not everything was the same. In Terminal B, one corner had changed permanently. What used to be an ordinary information board now displayed something different. A bronze plaque, polished to a subtle sheen, etched with 12 simple words. Dignity needs no permission to board. It walks with its ticket. Below it, in smaller letters, in honor of Judge Malcolm Reed, whose silence spoke volumes. Every day, people stopped to read it. Some paused in reflection, others took pictures. A few simply nodded and kept walking, unaware that behind those words was the seed of a quiet revolution. Elsewhere that same morning, Melissa Graham sat in a small sunlit office. Not in uniform, not at an airport, but in the basement of a local government re-entry center. After her formal dismissal, the airline industry closed its doors to her. Most people assumed she'd quietly disappeared. In a way she had. But in another way, she was beginning something unexpected. Court-mandated restorative justice training had led her here. At first, she had resented every hour, but during one particular session, she'd sat across from a young Latino man, wrongfully accused of fare evasion, and something in his story cracked her open. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry. He just wanted to be seen. And in his presence, she realized how invisible she had been. Not to others, but to her conscience. "I don't think I was racist," she had once told the counselor. "I was just following protocol." "That's exactly how racism survives," the counselor replied gently, "when protocol becomes more powerful than perception." Now Melissa arrived early every Tuesday and Thursday to help run logistical support for those same sessions. Filing papers, making coffee, and, when permitted, listening. She hadn't earned forgiveness, but she had begun something harder: accountability. Meanwhile, in a downtown library in Atlanta, Daniel Whitmore sat beside his mother, staring at the screen as the MC on stage unfolded the results of the National Essay Contest. "Third place," the announcer said, reading from the envelope. "Second place," Daniel held his breath. "And first place, with an entry titled 'The Quiet Gate,' goes to Daniel Whitmore of Washington, D.C. The crowd clapped. Daniel blinked twice before slowly rising to his feet. His mother took his hand, stunned into joyful silence. The essay was being published, nationwide. His words and the ones he had hesitated to write would now be printed, studied, and read aloud in classrooms. And as he stood at the podium, facing hundreds of students, Daniel didn't boast. He didn't thank everyone with rehearsed notes. He didn't perform. He simply said, "I saw something that changed me. A man who didn't shout back, who didn't need to. He just stood there. And that silence has followed me ever since. Not as a weight, but as a reminder." He paused. "We don't always need a microphone. We just need to mean what we say and walk in it." At the same time, in a different city, Malcolm Reed sat on a bench beneath a cherry blossom tree, watching petals drift like snow. He had received Daniel's essay. It had been forwarded to him with a handwritten note. "You didn't just make a stand, Judge Reed. You gave someone else the courage to." It was signed, Professor Elaine Westbrook, Howard University, Department of Journalism. Malcolm closed the folder and smiled. He thought back to his youth, to the time when he too had wondered whether dignity had a place in the courtroom, the airport, the world. He had spent decades proving that it did, but it had taken one moment at Gate 12 to show him something else. Dignity wasn't about the courtroom. It was about how you behaved when no one expected you to defend yourself. The ripples hadn't stopped. Trans-Atlas Airlines, the airline involved in the original incident, had now expanded its Gatekeepers for Justice initiative into a full-fledged internal training division, not just videos and worksheets, but rotating story sessions led by guest speakers, social workers, and yes, even passengers. The first official internal documentary released was titled, "He Stood So We Could See." It was short, 28 minutes, no dramatic score, just interviews, real ones. Gordon Maddox, the CEO, narrated the intro. He didn't apologize again. He didn't dramatize. He simply said, "This isn't a corporate response. It's a human one." And the final image of the documentary, a clip of Judge Malcolm Reed walking away from Gate 12, coat buttoned, briefcase in hand, in silence. That was enough. And somewhere in a small high school in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a teacher pressed pause on the final frame. She turned to her students. "What did you see?" she asked. One girl raised her hand. "I saw a man who knew who he was." Another student added, "I saw what strength looks like when it's quiet." The teacher nodded. No further explanation needed. It started with a panel discussion. What was supposed to be a modest community event at the Lincoln Center in D.C., an evening titled "Justice in Transit: How We Treat Each Other on the Move," suddenly went viral when a familiar figure took the stage, Judge Malcolm Reed. The room was packed with lawyers, students, and flight attendants in civilian clothes. There were no flashy headlines, no dramatic lighting, just folding chairs, water pitchers, and a microphone that crackled every few minutes. But what Malcolm said that night would shift the conversation nationally. "This isn't about airlines," he said. "It's about reflexes. Who we believe. Who do we doubt? Who gets asked to explain themselves? And who's allowed to simply exist?" He leaned slightly forward, voice firm but calm. "When I was told my ID might be fake, I didn't get angry. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. But because I understood something bigger than me was at stake. The truth is, we've built a system that teaches suspicion, not protection, especially when it comes to race." The room went still. A reporter from the Washington Post was in the audience. By morning, his article was everywhere. "The judge who didn't raise his voice, but raised a nation's." That headline hit like a match to dry kindling. Within 72 hours, the clip of Malcolm's speech had been viewed over 4 million times on TikTok, and even more on YouTube and X, formerly Twitter. People were quoting him. Airlines were scrambling to issue statements. Airports across the country began reevaluating their gate training procedures. But it wasn't just the aviation world that was shaken. Schools began integrating the quiet gate essay into social ethics discussions. Churches held open forums. One high school in Chicago hosted an event titled, "What Would You Do at Gate 12?" Even Harvard Law Review published a special edition essay analyzing what they called the Reed response, the power of dignified silence in moments of racial aggression, and how it often shames institutions more than protests. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore, the teenager whose essay had touched hearts across the country, found himself invited to the National Youth Forum on Civil Liberties in Washington, D.C. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't bring a speech. He just wore the same soft blue shirt he'd worn on the day at Gate 12. It had become a kind of quiet armor, not because it made him brave, but because it reminded him of how far he had come from being invisible. Standing before a room full of senators, educators, and CEOs, Daniel said, "We don't need more rules. We need better instincts. We need to stop assuming that someone has to raise their voice to be right." And then he added, almost as an afterthought, "My mom always taught me, real strength doesn't shout." Judge Reed reminded me of that. The room fell silent. A kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of reckoning. Elsewhere, in a back office at Trans-Atlas Airlines, something rare was happening. A new initiative was being finalized, not by PR staff, but by a diverse coalition of employees, including flight attendants, gate agents, and even former passengers. They called it the Reed Protocol. It wasn't just a training. It was a shift in corporate culture. New hires would no longer just memorize scripts. They would attend real case study simulations, not with actors, but with guest speakers who had lived through humiliation and resilience. Melissa Graham's name was on the list, not as a cautionary tale, but as a guest. She had been asked to share not just her mistake, But the moment she realized what she had protected wasn't policy, it was her fear of being wrong. Her first words to the new class of hires were, "I thought I was upholding rules, but I was reinforcing walls." Back in Judge Reed's chambers, life resumed its rhythm. Legal briefs, court calendars, community outreach. But one thing had changed. Every month, the judge now hosts a free civic workshop titled Beyond the Gavel, How We Judge Without a Robe. It wasn't just for law students, it was for anyone who had ever been judged too quickly. Taxi drivers, janitors, formerly incarcerated individuals, youths from underfunded schools. Reed stood there, robe off, sleeves rolled up, asking hard questions like, what does it cost to be misread? Who's watching when it happens? And what do you do when you know, but saying something might make you the target? A girl in the back, no older than 15, once raised her hand and asked, "Sir, when you were at the airport, were you scared?" Reed smiled gently. "No, but I was sad, because I realized that for all my degrees and years of service, one uniformed employee still thought my face didn't belong in first class. And if that can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The ripple became a wave. Late-night hosts talked about it. Podcasts dissected it. Even the White House released a statement praising citizen-led courage in moments of casual injustice. And amid all of it, one particular image, still shot from surveillance footage, began circulating widely. It was of Judge Reed standing quietly with his boarding pass, being questioned. In the frame, you could barely see his face, but you could see the calm. That image was later turned into a poster for a national campaign titled, "Belonging, It Shouldn't Be a Question." 3 months after the incident at Gate 12, a different kind of flight was announced at Reagan National Airport. There was no destination listed, no boarding group numbers, no security warnings or weather delays. Just one clear message flashing across the terminal monitors in bold Navy letters. Flight 0R0, boarding now, a new standard for dignity. At Gate 12, the same gate where it all began, the area had been transformed. No longer just a waiting space, it had become a symbolic checkpoint, one where memory, truth, and reform intersected. A long navy blue curtain had been drawn back, revealing a simple but striking installation, a bronze bench shaped like an open book. On one side was the engraved quote, "You don't need to raise your voice to raise a nation." Below it, two names were etched side by side, Judge Malcolm Reed, Daniel Whitmore. Beside the bench stood the CEO of Transatlas Airlines, accompanied by key leaders from rival airlines, aviation regulators, union leaders, and members of the public. There were no press gimmicks, no confetti, just a calm reverence, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something that would outlast them. Malcolm approached the microphone last. He looked down at the podium for a moment, then up at the people gathered. He didn't carry any notes. "There are two kinds of silence," he began, "the kind that hides and the kind that holds. The silence I chose that day at Gate 12 was not surrender. It was a way of holding space for truth, for dignity, for change." He paused. And what followed wasn't noise. It was clarity. People nodded. Some dabbed at tears. Others simply stood, hands folded, taking in the weight of those words. Then, as if answering an invisible cue, a group of children stepped forward. Students from schools across the country, chosen to represent the next generation of travelers. Each child carried a boarding pass, but not made of paper. They were crafted from brushed aluminum, and instead of names and seat numbers, each one bore a word. Empathy, courage, awareness, belonging, justice. One by one, the children placed their boarding passes into a clear panel embedded into the bench, where they locked in magnetically, completing a sculpture titled, "The Boarding Gate of Tomorrow." Daniel, now slightly taller than 3 months ago and far more composed, was invited to say a few words. He didn't say much. "I just want to thank the people who listened, even when I wasn't speaking loud." Then he turned to Judge Reed and simply said, "Thank you for showing me how to sit in my seat with pride." The applause that followed was gentle, but long, the kind that doesn't celebrate victory, but reverence. In the months that followed, the ripple effects became institutionalized. The Reed Protocol was adopted not just by Transatlas, but by 5 major U.S. airlines, later influencing gate training programs internationally. The FAA formally recommended the model for all airport personnel by the end of the fiscal year. In public schools, a new curriculum was piloted titled First Class Starts in the Mind, a program exploring social cues, unconscious bias, and civic responsibility, inspired by Daniel's story. Across media, the viral footage and quotes were compiled into a short documentary titled Gate 12, Where Dignity Took Flight. It won Best Short Feature at the National Documentary Awards and was later included in airline in-flight entertainment across multiple carriers. And perhaps most poignantly, Terminal D at Reagan National was quietly renamed by congressional order, the Malcolm Reed Concourse. No big ribbon cutting, no gala, just a new nameplate installed late one night, and a silent promise beneath it, where all journeys begin with respect. A year later, a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood in front of the bronze bench with her father. She had just read the quote out loud and looked puzzled. "Daddy, what does it mean? Raise a nation?" Her father smiled. "It means sometimes you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes you just have to stand." She looked down at the bench, then back up at the flight screen above her. The next flight was boarding to Atlanta. Her eyes twinkled. "Do you think we'll sit in first class?" Her father knelt and said, "Wherever we sit, we'll sit like we belong." Not all revolutions begin with shouting. Sometimes the most powerful changes start in silence, in the quiet refusal to be diminished, in the calm defiance of being told you don't belong. In this story, Judge Malcolm Reed never raised his voice. Daniel Whitmore, just a boy, never lashed out. Yet together they shook the foundation of an entire industry. They reminded us, dignity doesn't demand permission to exist, but it requires courage to stand firm. Every small act, a glance, a word, a seat, can spark a wave of justice. And most of all, when you treat someone as if they don't belong, be careful. They may be the very person who rewrites the rules. This story is more than a cautionary tale for those in power. It's a quiet anthem for those who've been told to wait, to move, to sit in silence. You don't have to shout to change the world. You just have to stay in your seat and refuse to disappear.